Hi, everyone. My name is Benno Papari, and this is the Songwriters on Process podcast. Since 2010, I've interviewed over 300 songwriters about, well, their songwriting process. I don't care about favorite cities, tour stories, favorite foods, or anything like that. My goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat poets and more traditional prose writers. They are writers, plain and simple. In these interviews, we go deep into the specifics of the writing process. This is no, hey, do you start with the lyrics of the music type of interview. Now, a little bit about me. I'm not a songwriter. In fact, I've never written a song in my life. I have a PhD in English language and literature, and I'm a former academic. So as a prose writer, I enjoy exploring how my process intersects with those of songwriters. This is an intelligent conversation about writing between two writers. And that, of course, means we talk a lot about books. The site features interviews across all genres, from metal to jazz, from country to that big category known as indie. You'll find a couple of A-list actors on the site and several members of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as well. Now, I select songwriters to interview who fit into one of two categories. One, do I listen to them already? And two, if I don't, would they make for a compelling and intelligent interview? You can find these interviews across all podcast platforms, as well as at songwritersonpodcast.com. Do you have an idea for an interview or a comment about the site? Hit me up at ben@songwritersonprocess.com. Thanks for listening and enjoy. There's a point in this interview with Jerry Harrison of Talking Heads where I give him a quote by the iconic beat poet Allen Ginsberg and ask him to respond to it. And he says, well, Allen was my friend. And he starts to tell a story about Allen Ginsberg. And that is why he is Jerry Harrison of Talking Heads. If you know music, you know Talking Heads. Obviously, you know that one could argue, I would certainly argue, a lot of people would argue, one of the most influential bands in rock history. I don't think that's a stretch to say. The number of bands they have influenced and will continue to influence is endless. Just this was a joy to talk to him. It's funny. I think this ended up, you can't see this because we did this over video, over Zoom, but we spent a lot of time writing things down. This became like a discussion of literature. He would mention a book and I'd write it down. I'd mention a book, he'd write it down. So we spent all this time scribbling down book titles that the other had given to us. And so this was a discussion about literature. It was a discussion about poetry, the value of poetry, why songwriters should read poetry. We talked about the rituals of the writing, and he said the rituals we create in writing are a way for our minds to accept that we are writing. Those rituals create positive signals of positive reinforcement to our minds as a way of saying that there are no excuses since I'm in my writing space. He also, speaking of rituals, I love this because we always talk about pen and paper writing instruments. He prefers a felt tip pen, hates smooth ballpoint because he likes the resistance that felt tip gives him. He says, I like to feel the interaction between the instrument and the paper, the scraping of it. And Harrison went to Harvard and has a degree in visual art, and I believe it's in visual art. So so he has that background in there as well, which obviously informs his choice of writing utensil. But there are some great stories in this. He tells great stories about people he's worked with. We talked again about his process, and he offers advice, of course, to young songwriters. To summarize, yes, you should be writing every day. I don't think I've talked to many songwriters who have been around as long as he has who say otherwise. But again, there are times I felt like this was a book club, but it was truly an honor to talk to him. Again, such a hugely influential band on what came after. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Jerry Harrison of Talking Heads. Let's get started then.
Okay.
Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. So I always start by asking, as an artist, how important is it as a songwriter, I guess, in general, how important is it? What are your thoughts on creating every day versus creating when the mood strikes? I mean, I think if when I mention this to novelists find it absurd because a novelist would say you got to write every day. Hemingway would say you got to write every day. But songwriters often don't feel that way. So I'm curious how you feel about that idea.
Well, I would just say for myself, lyrics were always the much more of a challenge for me than the music. And I was pretty self-conscious as a songwriter, having been in bands with both Jonathan Richman and David Byrne. I kind of felt the bar was awfully, and it's been funny because I produced a live record where they did this record that has now disappeared, but they had a different singer named Chris Shin, but Chris, when he wrote his lyrics, he wrote a few songs that worked for him, but there were songs that didn't sound like live voice at all. And so actually my daughter and I wrote a lot of the lyrics. And it was a lot easier to be writing for somebody else than it was for myself, because I didn't feel if it just worked, that was fine. It didn't have to be, let's say, it didn't have to somehow pass the literary barrier of like, how is this going to stand up in the context of where I've been? So when I was doing my solo records, it was really a challenge for me. And I actually never got, like, I would work on writing a record, sometimes over a number of years because I was recording them at the same time and stuff like that. But it was really like I had to sort of, there was a little bit of that element of you have to lock yourself in a room and not let yourself out until you come out with something. I think that the really prolific writers very often do it often enough that it's something they can turn on and off, and they can. I have a job to do. They also take, they have notebooks. They keep, they have a system, so to speak, right? I remember talking to Billy Joel about it one time, and he goes, "I'm an animal when I have to write a record. I have to lock myself away. My wife can't be around me because she'll divorce me." It's like, and so I was a little bit of that. It was like, for me, when I was songwriting, I did things like I'll go off to the desert or something like that and spend, which sometimes is really frustrating. So you spend a week there, you don't like anything you did. Why did I do this? So my answer is that if you're an up and coming songwriter, you should try and start doing it every day, because you should get the habit down, and you should get. There's a whole thing in writing of breaking free of your self-criticisms, and it's not about songwriting, but my writing as prose really, because I was my major in college was there was a new major called Visual and Environmental Studies, which ended up being I had thought it was going to be, for me, architecture, but I didn't like those courses. So I ended up getting very involved with a person who became my mentor, and I did paintings and sculptures. I studied animation. I did documentary filmmaking. So I wrote fewer papers than anybody I knew in college, except for some of the scientists, will say. So, but I worked for a computer software development company who wrote manuals for like digital equipment, and this is before Microsoft existed, before Apple existed. And the technical writers, like if I wrote letters, they didn't do, but if I wrote something that was going to be distributed, some of it being sort of sales material, they'd go over it. And their withering criticisms of my writing were amazingly helpful, because unlike in college, where you would just being clear wasn't enough, they would start talking about stylistic flourishes, and you'd study, the great writers and how they, how sonorous the sound of the sentences were when you read them out loud, stuff like that. All that these people cared about was that it was clear. And they didn't care if you used the same structure for sentences over and over again, as long as it was clear. And they use colons a lot. And I got into this idea of using colons and lists of things. And you can imagine in software, it's like you take 4 steps, colon, 1, you do this like this, you know, it is colon, either this or that, you know. And but I tried to teach this to my kids as a way of organizing their writing, but it has worked really well for me in business and in communicating. And I also had the interesting experience, which I think you will get a pleasure out of, is that I was involved with a company that I was on the board of directors of, a microprocessor company, and we were involved in an enormous patent infringement suit against Intel and Dell, which we ended up selling for $300 million. This was a big deal. And the two best things I read that year was the legal brief that was written by this one woman at Sussman Godfrey, and Elizabeth Hardwick's obituary or memorial to Robert Lowell in the New York Review of Books. And they were diametrically opposed kinds of writing. The legal brief was a little more like what I was describing, the technical writers writing, just amazingly clear and flowed beautifully, stuff like that. But Elizabeth Hardwick is like, she had this ability to sort of play with language. It was so, she had just done it so much that she could have really long sentences and then a short one. And just, it's like, you just kind of felt that it was like she was juggling with words or something like that. So anyway, my recommendation, I guess, to up and coming songwriters is do it all the time. And then, you know, I do know a number of people you do with, like, you know, a number of songs that David would write. And you go like, I tried to write a song like something, and I'm going like, well, it's a great song, but you really didn't succeed. It doesn't sound anything like that to me, which is a good thing, because we won't get sued for any infringement.
Right.
And I don't know if anyone will notice, but it was a means to an end for you.
So I have some quotes up here, speaking of authors, that I like to read to songwriters, and I'm going to read this one to you by Allen Ginsberg. And I'd like to know how you think it applies to songwriting. He said, and it reminds me of what you said a few minutes ago about being self-conscious. He said, to gain your own voice, you have to forget about having it heard.
Yeah, I mean, I think you should try to be fearless, but you know, I don't think there's anything, you know, I've had the unfortunate experience of having sort of going out on a limb and saying something a little bit a little stupid or something a little bit off the cuff, and then like having a review in the NME, and they completely zeroed in on the one line in the one song that I found the most embarrassing on the record. And so if you could be totally thick-skinned that you don't mind that happening to you, then be fearless. But I think it's okay to sometimes say, like, you know, am I going to be happy with this 5 years from now too? You know?
Yeah.
But I mean, you have to write the right balance. I mean, I have worked with a lot of songwriters and made records with people who have what I call completion anxiety, and they will not ever, like, they always want to be able to go, if someone has a criticism, well, it's not finished, or I'm still working on it, because they just can't take the criticism. And I mean, one of the big jobs I've had as a producer is to get people to go like, look, we've tried all these different ideas. This is the best one. We're finished. It sounds great. We're finished. I'm not saying that you might not write a better song coming in the future. And I'm not saying that this couldn't be readdressed sometime, but we're not it's like we've started to go around in circles or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, you're wasting your own time. We're wasting our time, you know. But then there's times where you have to go like, you're right. It's not good enough. We've got to make it better. Well, you know, that also, I knew Ginsberg. And so that summed him up too. He had the first time I met him, he just walked up and grabbed me and kissed me on the lips. So that was his attitude about it. I think that's how he felt about his poetry as well.
That's great. I've never read a quote from an author and that person says, "I knew that person." So, but I realize who I'm talking to. How about the idea the preciousness of the process. I mean, um, I worry, and I'm a prose writer, not a songwriter. I've never written a song in my life, but for me, I have a very specific ritual. For example, I write in one chair, I revise in another. There are certain things I have to have with me, and things like that. But I worry sometimes that by making it that precious, it gives me an excuse to say, "Oh, I can't write now because I'm not in that space." And I think about that a lot with songwriters when some of them, to intentionally make it not precious, they will write on the back of like utility bills or stationery rather than that fine, moleskin notebook.
Yeah.
And I worry about myself because I think that's an excuse, right? I'm not in that chair, so I can't do it now. So do you, yeah, how do you feel about that? I mean, how precious should it be, or do you feel like making it precious is a hindrance to the process, if that makes sense?
It makes sense. And my general feeling is that the ritual that you created, that people create for writing, are mechanisms for saying, okay, I'm in the spot where I do this, and that your mind says, okay, I have to accept that I'm doing this. So it's actually what you're attempting to do is create signals of positive reinforcement for your mind to say, sort of, I have no excuses because I'm in my writing place. I don't think it's good that it ever says like I can't do it because I'm someplace else. Because if you have a good idea, write it down.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you do. I think, but you might say I don't formally sit down to write, but I will capture if I have an idea, I write it down, and whatever I can keep, I can do that. And I wouldn't think it would be a bad idea to try experimenting with that. But if, for instance, the room that my wife and I have, there's no good way to put drapes on it, so I sleep with an eye mask. And I think that putting the eye mask on is also a signal to my body, like it's time to go to sleep, because sleep is difficult for me. So like all of these. So I think that sometimes people build up rituals. And in fact, I think that religion, and sometimes, and some of the religious things are by doing things by rote, you prepare yourself for things. And, obviously all the martial arts are about this, is that, all this idea of imagining yourself in the situation and being able to hit the baseball, and that you're able to do this. It's this idea of programming your mind to actually be able to react quickly enough when it's an athletic situation to the event, because you've tried, in this, they have all, I can't remember all the words, but it's even like even the power of positive thinking or whatever these things are. They are ways to, you might say, you're getting yourself in the place where you think that you will be, that your fastest reactions will be available to you.
So is there a ritual to your process? Was there maybe time of day, things you have to have with you, things like that?
It was usually work to me, so I did it in the day. It felt like work, right? The writing the lyrics. Once I got to the point that it was like, it was sort of like performing it or something like that, then very often that could be at night. I mean, your voice doesn't, your voice sounds better later in the day when you're more awake and have been up for a while, and you're less likely to have a stuffed up nose or anything like that. So that when it came to performing it, but the actual writing process I thought of as a daytime experience. Similarly, when you're making records, like when you're cutting basic tracks and you kind of know what you want to do, or if you want to be in a sort of groove mood, that could often be at night, and that's the best time to do it. But if you're trying to thread a needle on of finding an overdub, like this is the hard part that happens at the end of making records. All of the parts that are obvious are there, and you feel like it still needs something else. And finding that sound can be amazingly laborious. I mean, sometimes it takes days to just do the simplest little thing because you just knew it needed something else. And you go like, well, is it a string part? No. Is it horns? No. Is it this? Is that? No, 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 no. And that you want to do not when you're tired. You want to be awake and you want to be sharp and you also want to be decisive. Other times you want to be in a mood that you're open and able to allow things to come in. And that's usually later in the day, and and I would think in the writing process, and I don't, it's been a while since I've been doing songwriting really seriously, except in helping other bands where it needs a bridge and I'm helping them with that. I'm actually pretty proud of some of the lyrics I came up with for some of these other people. I wrote this song with this guy about his house burning down, and it was, it was pretty cool, and and he was in the fire and he was looking for his brother and he had to get out, and and it was a house that had been owned by Jan and Dean and stuff like that. I mean, it had all, well, that was a pretty successful song. I mean, I think to me, the lyrics that I feel the most closest to are "Man with a Gun" for my own lyric writing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when I look, I really, but I've listened. I also Ernie Brooks, who was in the Modern Lovers with me, was a student of poetry, and so he introduced me why I knew Ginsberg and stuff like that as I started going to poetry readings with Ernie, because he was good friends with Denise Levertov because her son, Mitchell Goodman, who was part of the Chicago Seven, was his father, and they had gone to Putney together. So then Denise taught at MIT, and so we got to know this woman, Elsa Dorfman, who was a photographer but also a poet, who lived in Cambridge, and she would have a soiree after these poetry readings, and so I got to be really good friends with Robert Creeley. And he, in particular, I really, really liked his poetry, and I liked the brevity of it and the sort of mathematical precision of it. I found it took me a little bit longer to get into the sort of sprawling nature of, say, Allen Ginsberg. But I certainly understood the difference between, say, Yeats and and English poets. I mean, I think the English poets in general, a lot of it was how it looked on the page.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the Irish poets, coming from a more oral tradition, it was how it sounded. And it sometimes didn't look so good, and these sort of two threads of how you think about poetry. But so Ernie then became a collaborator when I was writing. And what we would do is we would often come up with subject matter, and then he would kind of come up with lots of phrases. And then sometimes I had an idea about what I thought the verse should be about. And then I would kind of have this group of phrases or words and help put that together, but in the end, it was something that I could feel that it seemed coherent to me and I could sing. So that was really, really helpful. I mean, it was sort of a much more advanced version of a rhyming dictionary, but it was maybe it was like Chat GBC will be good for people. Some phrases that I could use here and there.
Right. I just interviewed Devendra Banhart last week, and we were lamenting over the fact he has entire bookshelves of poets that he showed me. But it's distressing how many songwriters I've interviewed. I could probably count on one hand the number who are avid poetry readers. They may be voracious fiction writers, but not poetry.
Yeah.
And it's distressing because I feel like I know it's not set to music, but I think you can certainly learn as a songwriter by reading good poetry. Don't you think?
Yes. But it took me a long time to appreciate poetry in the same way. Ernie was having someone who was so close to me, so into it, helped me. And going to these readings, I mean, sometimes I'd fall asleep in them. And it seemed like I'd always wake up when Robert Greeley was reading, so that's why. But he the it is a it is a sort of a higher form of language to a degree, and therefore, and also it has the ability to be very free form.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it has, and certain kinds of poetry is insanely economical in getting an idea across. So I think that I think it's good for any kind of writer, but songwriters obviously, because you are to read some poetry, but you have to read for them. They need to read it. I mean, out loud, and hear the phrasing of how someone said this and how the internal rhymes work, or how the rhyme is the beginning of the next sentence. And things like that, and how the poets are playing with that structure of language. And if they can apply that in their own songwriting, then they probably will make their songwriting more sophisticated and deeper in some way. There's also this whole thing. You were talking about about questioning your own writing, but there also is that thing about using cliches in songwriting or using them in poems. But at some points, they can be very powerful.
Really?
And then sometimes they're like, I just can't believe you're saying that. So it's like like George Clinton will use cliches and he repeats them over and over again, and yet they take on a whole new meaning somehow, right? And it's do you have the flexibility to be able to? I think Paul Simon has written about the idea of using cliches in writing, and
that's fascinating because whenever you teach writing, you teach never use cliches. It's stale language. Someone's used it already, so don't use that. I've never heard that angle though. That you could do that. The other thing I think practically is poetry just isn't in the public the way it used to be. I mean, when Seamus Heaney died, I think I told someone, I don't know after him, is he the last poet who will receive a front page New York Times obit above the fold? I mean, after he passed away, I don't know that, there just aren't that many left that when they pass, it's a big event. And I have a signed poem. One of my favorite poets is Galway Kinnell, and I have a signed poem by him. I bought it at Powell's bookstore. And when I was there, this is about 5 or 6 years ago. It's big, 18 by 24, 24 by 36, and it's signed at the bottom. And I remember buying it, and I got very emotional actually when I was paying for it. I mean, I was, and the guy is probably thinking like, "What's wrong with this guy? Just give me the money." I was very emotional because he means so much to me as a poet, and to actually have something that he, at some point, had touched. But we have that poem hanging in our in downstairs, and I'll go up to it, and every time I read it, I find something new I never noticed before. That's also, I think, the beauty of poetry, is that there's always that the read is the discovery, whether it's sounds or images or the way the lines connect that I didn't see before.
I mean, I feel I'm still I don't read poetry enough or with enough, and I don't have the closeness to what I say someone like Ernie did, but it's, I learned enough to know how terrific it could be. And I do think that it, I mean, probably, someone like Eminem, you would say, is the new modern poet, and brilliant at it. And really much, you might say in the Irish tradition, in this kind of oral, sometimes, it's also this idea of like long poems versus short poems. Ginsberg poems are almost all really long.
Right?
That they, and it's the buildup of imagery. It's this kind of, it's sort of like a fight with lots of lots of, instead of not one knockout punch, it's lots of little hits.
Well, a great example of that, I was in Cleveland a few years ago and I went to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it was the year that Chicago and NWA were both inducted at the same year. And they have the same, they have the lyric, the original, the handwritten lyrics, and they had Just You and Me by Chicago. And then they had some NWA song, and they were happened to be next to each other. And what was amazing about the NWA song was that you could see them getting to the end of the line and they were running out of room, and they're continuing the line at the end and going up and going down. And it was like they were trying to fit all those images in that line. And it was so interesting to see those two songs. And that's what I think about when you mention that, kind of all those imagery and I could just imagine them writing it and thinking, it's got to fit on this line. How can I make it fit there?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then that's that playing with meter and it like overlapping into the next line. And then how do you make sense of that and then say it or sing it so that it makes sense to somebody?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the other thing about, poetry well read is a really wonderful thing. And I think that, I wasn't a fan particularly of The Last Poets when that came out, that was, I think rap was a much better version of that.
Yeah.
But the sophistication that, that the more modern rappers have had who have like gone, you listen to some of the early songs and they seem pretty pedantic and pretty simple,
Yeah. Oh,
and,
yeah.
powerful, sometimes powerful in their directness, but then there's a sophistication of the rhyming schemes and stuff like that came along. So, yeah. And it's, it's also, I see in like, in both David and Jonathan's writing. I have you heard the newer records that I've done with Jonathan? I've done a few more.
Yeah.
He's so fun. He's a perfect example of using something that sort of is like a cliche, but sort of making it his own. And, like me and here on the beach, me and here on the beach, me and here on the beach. But it just works so well. Look, there's a seagull. Me and here on the beach. It's if you write it down, you go like, this is like nonsense. It's almost sort of childlike, and yet he makes it so it's like, God, that's so much fun, or that's such a cool song.
The other thing I want to say is there's a great novel I read called Fall Back Down When I Die, and the author is Joe Wilkins, and he teaches creative writing at a university in Montana, and he's from Montana. And the book it's a fiction, but the book has to do with land rights issues in Montana, and he's a poet by trade, but he's written a couple of novels. And when a poet can write a novel, to me, that's the highest art, because you've got the imagery, the sounds, the way that the economy of language, but it's plot driven, and it's a masterful book. So Fall Back Down When I Die by Joe Wilkins. It's a great book. A couple more questions. So as a songwriter, did or do you prefer pen and paper or typewriter, computer? I find that songwriters are very particular about how they actually get the lyrics down.
I usually use pen and paper.
Yeah. Is there a reason for that, or just because it's handier, or was there more of the tactile element of it, or maybe the fact that
I like the tactile nature of pencils in particular, or pens that have enough. I don't like really smooth writing. Like ballpoint. I like felt tip pens better than ballpoint. I like things that have a little bit of resistance.
Ooh, why is that? I've never heard that before. That's great.
Some of that has to do with maybe, having done drawing and stuff like that too, is I like to feel the interaction between the writing instrument and the paper or the whatever you're on. I like the feeling, the scraping of it, so to speak. And if it just flows, it can get too messy too. So I like that. When I write letters and prose and things like that, or anything, I always type it. And And I use a computer and I type. And um, I I had to take handwriting lessons like a lot in elementary school. So I taught myself to type at a pretty early age in seventh grade. So I became pretty fluid with being able to use a keyboard, and I touch type, and so what I like about it is you can actually get a lot closer to how fast you're thinking about something
When you type.
when you type.
Oh yeah, I guess I could that I never thought about it that way, but it's a real time. I guess the closer you get to real time, the more authentic the thoughts.
I mean, there's sometimes where that's why it's good to talk and you just record what you're thinking. Usually when you actually it writes down, it's like and it's not quite as clear as you thought. But anyway, I find typing is good when I'm really like you're in the flow of like you wanted to write like like an essay about something, but you're trying to make a point in a letter, stuff like that. I much prefer that than to trying to write it with my hand, because I don't write enough now that my hand doesn't get tired.
Yeah.
But lyrics are like you're more like you're writing down something and crossing it out and trying a word and things like that. So it's a slower process, and so it's also paper's much better for crossing out and putting an arrow up and writing something and doing things like that. And on the computer, like how do you have the other options? And the formatting issues on the computer are too much of a pain in the ass to try and figure out how you're going to do that. And just writing, you can copy it and then write. There are times where I do things on the computer where I'll take a paragraph and then I want to rewrite it. So I copy it and then I do a second version of it so I can compare. That works fine for those sort of things. But for writing lyrics to a song or something like that, I don't think that's, I think that David might have typed at times. I mean, I know there's a lot of handwritten lyrics that he did too, mainly. Because most of the times that he showed things like there were certain album covers that would show the original lyrics. But,
I interviewed Daniel Lanois a couple of years ago, and he said that all of his lyrics are on 11 by, kind of what you're saying, all of his lyrics are on 11 by 22 art paper, because he can put those thought bubbles, those arrows, and it's not a linear process. It's the furthest thing from a linear process, but he had just had all these things in all different places because that kind of was how his mind worked.
Yeah.
So
that's an interesting idea, a much bigger piece of paper.
Yeah, big. I think he said 11 by 22. Unlined, and it was just blank, and then there was just stuff all over the place because he just didn't know where things were going to go. He was not, and I'm the same way. My first drafts of anything I write, I worship at the altar of Anne Lamott, who read this essay called "Shitty First Drafts." About it must be 30 years old. I might be, but and that's her whole thing. Is she said the first draft should be terrible. And the essay, Shitty First Drafts, it's from her book Bird by Bird, but the essay is from there. But that's her whole thing is the first draft should be terrible, because that if you think too much about what the words look like on the page, and I told students this, that it crushes your momentum as a thinker if you're thinking too much about those words you just set down.
Well, I think you kind of hit the thing. It's like all of these things is like you want to try and create some momentum if you can get some momentum going when you're writing. And so if being in the same location helps you have momentum, then that's a good thing. If you can fetishize the situation, and you can't do anything until you do it. And then, I mean, we all have these experiences where suddenly you clean the house instead of working on this, because you wanted to feel productive. You had drunk a bunch of coffee, you had energy, and yet you were having some kind of writer's cramp. And so you do something like, well, this room really needs straightening up.
I can tell you how many songwriters said that exact same thing, that they have to clean before they start to write. I mean, exactly what you said. It has to be a clean room. But the one thing I was going to say was, you talk about momentum. To me, I think writer's block, in quotes, happens not because we don't know what to say, but because we don't know where to begin. And there's a there's a story about Joseph Conrad, who would write 10 to 20 page letters to his family members complaining about his writer's block and not realizing the irony. And I start writing wherever the hell I have the most to say.
Yeah.
If that's the intro, that's great. It rarely is, but I find that starting to write wherever I have the most to say, that's the momentum that keeps me going, rather than saying, oh, I have all that stuff to say later on, but I can't say it yet because I haven't written the beginning yet.
My mother told me a story about Joseph Conrad, that his wife would have to drag him back to the writing chair or something like that. Like, no, you have to do this. And pull him back. Of course, he was writing, he was not even writing in his native language. I mean, the idea that he could be so eloquent in English was.
It was like, I think English was like his 8th language or something. It wasn't even his 2nd or his 3rd. I mean, that's mind blowing.
Yeah. And it's, you can almost tell that it's like he's not a native English writer. It feels a little like it was work, and yet it has this amazing clarity in the way it. But all these different authors have these things about them that you enjoy. Sometimes it's the people who have. Fitzgerald had this ease with language that it just feels like it. He had problems with the way his stories ended, in my mind. It's like, Tender as the Night really has sort of a disappointing ending. Sort of tails off.
Yeah.
The idea of Dick Diver ending up in upstate New York is, I don't it just doesn't quite hit the romance that it started with,
Right.
Well, all these things are so interesting. And it's so interesting. Like my mother recommended this. My mother and my father recommended some really unusual books to me. One was, my mother had met this guy named Negley Farson, who wrote a book, The Way of a Transgressor. And it was about knowing John Reed in Moscow right during the Russian Revolution. But it paints this picture that is really like, if you read 10 Days That Shook the World, you have this whole other understanding by reading this guy. And then my father recommended The Riddle of the Sands by Erskine Childers, which is, Erskine Childers he ended up dying. He had fought for the English, but then he was part of the Irish Revolution. But he wrote this book, which was about some people doing sailing in the Baltic at the sort of end of the season, and being entertained by a German, like there was a German warship, and they sent over, like, who are these English gentlemen here, right? And he notices that the Germans are doing something really weird. And as it works out, it was preparing light boats in the rivers that flowed into the sea, that on a high tide could be floated and with troops and cross the channel and invade England in a totally way that had never been thought of by the English naval staff, which they completely changed how they were going to, that they had to pay attention to this, that it had revealed the weakness that they no one had ever pointed out to them.
There's so much great writing out there that it's almost overwhelming. I mean, one of my favorite books I've read is a book called The Miracle Country, and the woman's name is Kendra Atlee-Work, and she lives in the Sierra Nevada. And I will put that in the chat also, in the Sierra Nevada. And she's grew up in a small town, I think, called Bishop in California. And it's a memoir of growing up in this small town and all she endured with the family. And it's an amazing book, but it's also intertwined with the idea of how Northern California is getting starved by it's losing all of its water to Southern California. And so it's this memoir, but it's also environmental a book on the environment. And she's a fantastic writer, but those stories, the memoir intertwined with, hey, basically there's a giant, pipe that's stealing all of our water that LA County owns, if I have it correctly.
Yeah, it's the Owens. Yeah, it's largely for the Owens Valley. No, I think it's the Owens. Have you read Cadillac Desert? Yeah, if you want to know about water in the West, this is it's a must read.
Yeah.
He, I knew him. His daughter and my daughter are good friends. Ruthie Reisner. So Mark Reisner, I think his name is.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, I wrote it down.
It's a terrific book. And it has all the stuff that like is the backstory of Chinatown. It's like
Right.
a chapter in the book and stuff.
Right.
So it's really great. I mainly read nonfiction, but have you read 1491 and 1493?
When did those come out?
I don't know, a decade or so ago.
Yeah, I think I bought it. I'm so horrible with my Kindle. I buy all these damn books and I just have next thing I have 50 books to read. I think I may have bought one of those, but not the second one.
Well, you want to read 1491 first, which is basically the world before Columbus, and then 1493 is the world after Columbus. But they completely change your whole sense of things. I mean, they really are. There's also a terrific writer, a science writer named David Montgomery, who wrote a book called Dirt, The Rise and Fall of Civilization by How Much Dirt It Has.
Wow.
He wrote another book called The Hidden Half of Nature or something like that, which is fantastic too. So, yeah. So, well, anyway, I'm delighted to get these suggestions.
Yeah.
And finally, do you know Alta California, this magazine?
No, what is it? I'm writing all these down frantically. So what is it again?
It's called Alta California, ALTA.
Okay.
It's a monthly magazine that my roommate in college, William Randolph Hearst III, is put out, and it's a great read. And it's like the New Yorker. It's great to have in your bathroom. It's something that it's sort of like you want to read every article in it. And like the New Yorker, it has cartoons, it has poetry, it has fiction, and it has articles about things. And it's a nice big sort of the old Rolling Stone size.
Yeah.
So if it has pictures, they're big enough that you can actually look at them. I recommend it to everybody, really.
And that's it for today's episode. Check back in a couple of weeks for a new episode. I do try to post these every 2 weeks, sometimes with more frequency, sometimes with less. A lot of that depends on my work commitments, my family commitments, and also when artists can talk to me. It's not easy to get these interviews. Speaking of interviews, did you know this is a relatively new podcast? I only started podcasting about a year ago. Well, depending on when you're listening to this, I should say 2022. But from 2010 to 2022, all of my interviews were transcribed and they are all there archived for you to go down that deep rabbit hole. So if you go to songwritersonpodcast.com and click on from the archives at the top, you'll see all of those transcribed interviews. I think there's over 200. So go down that rabbit hole. There's a lot of great interviews there. But you'll find all of those there. Again, the podcast itself is relatively recent. So there's a lot of reading you need to be catching up on with those old interviews. Speaking of interviews, if you have suggestions for interview subjects or want to comment or complain, anything like that, email me at ben@songwritersonprocess.com. That's ben@songwritersonprocess.com. And that's it for today's episode. This wraps it up. Thank you very much for listening and have a good one.